Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to our Way Forward Workshop Leader Lunch Break. One of the advantages of being digital is that we have a national reach, and that's what has happened this afternoon. We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Todd Michney, who is speaking to us. It looks to be from the shores of Lake Erie, even though I suspect you're sitting at home in Georgia. Is that correct?
Well, I'm actually in the Boston area right now, and I've got a background of Midtown Atlanta, where I live.
I could lose my job for that one. Thank you for the correction. Reminiscent somewhat of Cleveland. So
Indeed.
Dr. Michney is on faculty of the School of History and Sociology at Georgia Tech. He did, however, earn his bachelor's degree from Case Western Reserve University. He is the author of the book Surrogate Suburbs: Black Upward Mobility and Neighborhoods Change in Cleveland from 1900 to 1980. He is recognized for his work in digitizing historical records and thereby making them accessible for research. He received an award for excellence in educational use of historical records and has been the recipient of a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to continue this work in digitization. He's worked as a key member in the Center for Urban Innovation Research team. His own interests lie in African American history, urban history, race and ethnicity, and labor history. His current book project is Building Our Own Future: African Americans and the Construction Industry. He has written extensively on redlining and its impact, and it is that work that he's going to share with us today. Dr. Michney, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marianne, for that kind introduction. And thank you so very much for having me. It's my great honor and pleasure to be able to speak with you today. And I've broadened it out a bit beyond just redlining, but I want to encourage you to ask me any questions you may have about that. I've actually published several articles recently, and I can point you in the direction of more resources if you're interested in that topic in particular. I can get my slides to advance here. Okay, so as mentioned, I'm the author of Surrogate Suburbs, which came out in 2017, and I'm going to explain why I chose that title in just a moment. Basically, it's a study of African American neighborhoods that lay outside of the downtown area, outside of the heavily segregated, concentrated area where 90% of Cleveland's Black population lived as of 1930. So I was interested in looking at places like Glenville and Mount Pleasant and Lee Harvard going back to the turn of the 20th century. So how I wanted to couch this today was to introduce two concepts that sociologists and historians use to understand inequality and really just how people lead their lives in a given society. And so I want to encourage you to think about these, and we can discuss and maybe even debate them and see what's the relative significance of structure and agency. So structure would be the kind of large-scale social and economic arrangements that help to determine the shape of a given society. And then you would counterbalance that with agency. That would be the capacity of individuals to exercise their free will and to act independently. So everyone has to come to terms with these large-scale structures, which may be laws. They may be the job opportunities available to people. They may be what the practices surrounding giving of bank loans are. So everyone aspires to take control of their own destiny and act, but realistically, every society has these constraints, and those evolve over time. You can change those if you build up enough momentum to create a change in the social and political structure. And I was really grabbed by this quote, kind of haunted by it, that I came across reading a book called The Origins of the Urban Crisis. I don't know if anyone's ever read that by Thomas Segru, but it's an excellent study of Detroit explaining what happened to Detroit after World War II and how it went from being this arsenal of democracy with good paying union jobs to being heavily deindustrialized and struggling in many cases. And that story applies to some degree or other to many other cities, including Cleveland. So I had Cleveland on the mind, being from Cleveland myself. And this quote kind of almost set up a challenge for me to understand this relationship. And I initially thought that maybe there was too much emphasis on structure, that didn't really acknowledge the possibilities that people might have to take control of their own destiny. And so in my book, I looked at these places that I described as surrogate suburbs. And those were areas that served the purpose of suburbs. They weren't located actually in the bona fide suburbs. They were within the city limits, but they had newer housing, they had larger yards, they had a possibility to achieve the kind of American dream suburban lifestyle that African Americans were just as interested in as any other Americans. So I documented the existence of these communities. I was curious about African Americans living in small numbers on the urban periphery. Like you can see this young Black girl in Cleveland's Glenville neighborhood as early as the 1910s. There were Black students at Glenville High School in the 1920s. I was very interested at the process of institution building, how African Americans went about building churches, raising money to do that, some cases building them with their own hands, as in the case of Mount Olive Baptist Church. I was interested in African American financial institutions like Empire Savings and Loan, and after World War II, the Quincy Savings and Loan that lent so that African Americans could get bank loans when they were denied at mainstream banks. I was interested in real estate companies, insurance companies, all the kind of Black entrepreneurial activities that help to offset the kind of structural inequality and discrimination that so many Black families faced. I found out about Black builders and later studied that in more depth with a project with the Cleveland Restoration Society. Found out that there were a number of active Black builders, especially in the Lee Harvard and Lee Seville area, that built modern suburban style homes for upwardly mobile Black families. I found out about a rich homeowner activism tradition in Black neighborhoods that maintained the quality of life in these neighborhoods really through the 1970s. And at that point, certain suburbs were really starting to open to the Black middle class. So a lot of people moved from places like Lee Harvard to Warrensville Heights, to Bedford, to Shaker, of course, which began earlier. And so that was really how I couched the book. And it wasn't just something that I was trying to emphasize. Really, there was a perception among at least Cleveland's Black middle class that Cleveland was a relatively good place to be. And this is an article from the one of the most popular Black magazines, Jet. As late as 1954, a substantial portion of African Americans themselves considered Cleveland to be a fairly good place to make a living. So what happened after that, we can discuss in more detail. But in emphasizing that agency side and the kind of choices and ways that Black people were able to find houses and make communities despite discrimination, I still was coming up against the patterns of segregation in Cleveland that were just as intense as any similar city. And what I'm showing you here is a map of census tracts. Those are areas of about 10,000 people. And at what census year did they become majority Black? So if you focus on the east side, which I'm going to do in a second, you can see there's really only one historic Black community on the west side, which is the West Park community along Bel Air and 117th, which has been partially destroyed by a freeway, actually. But you can see that on the west side. If we focus on the east side, and I just kind of flip through the decades, you can see this outward expansion in two vectors, to the northeast and to the southeast, moving into Glenville, then into Huff by 1960. You can see Mount Pleasant, Lee Seville in the southeast, Lee Harvard kind of filling in. And I was really struck when I realized this pattern also extended to the suburbs. So even though African Americans have achieved geographic mobility and been able to move out of the inner city into places with newer, better quality housing, they've still done so in a way that has not substantially changed the pattern of segregated living in Cleveland. And in fact, Cleveland is one of the most segregated metropolitan areas in the entire country. What I'm showing you here is a ranking for 2010. That's the year for which we have the most recent statistics. And you can see a slight improvement in the segregation index. And just to tell you what that is, that's the number of Black people that would have to move in order to achieve an even distribution. So to get an even distribution of all people, regardless of race, still 74% of all African Americans would have to move in order to do that. So it gives you some sense of just how intensely segregated Cleveland remains to be, even if there's something to this reputation of Cleveland being relatively good, especially compared to Chicago and Detroit. And I'll explain why those are particularly important case studies. So today, I know I'm trying to do a lot here, and I'll try and not be overly ambitious in the interest of time, but I wanted to look at 4 really historic drivers of race-based housing inequality. And those are socioeconomic standing. Really what I'm talking about there is job discrimination. So if people can't get well-paying jobs, that's just going to delimit what kind of housing they can afford, right? Land use controls would be another one, especially restrictive covenants, deed restrictions, and zoning, which are ways that there can be restrictions placed on how land is used. And that historically, as I'll explain, has often been tied to race. Access to financing, that's an important one. So if you can't get a loan at a bank to buy where you can afford to buy, that was the situation faced by a lot of Black middle-class buyers looking for homes. That's another driver of historic housing inequality. And those first 3 are largely more on the structural side. If we start to look at agency, and all of these have some degree of structure and agency in a dynamic, for the first 3 even as well. But the third one, collective action by white residents, where all these other kinds of means of promoting segregation failed, there was always a possibility of collective action by white residents, whether that was intimidation, whether that was harassment. And that, characterized Cleveland, if not to the same extent as other places like Detroit and Chicago, it still was a factor. You could even think about something like decisions to move, so white people moving to suburbs, and Black people moving to certain areas in the interest of strength in numbers. So that's maybe one that you can more see the role of agency and how that plays out. So a lot of details here. I know this is being recorded, so you can look up some of these things if you want more details. I'm just going to briefly cover in this slide some of the race and socioeconomic major events. Starting with World War II, there was a push for access to defense jobs. So we had a March on Washington movement led by A. Philip Randolph, the African-American labor leader, that resulted in an executive order. President Franklin Roosevelt issued an order that established a Fair Employment Practices Committee, and it investigated discrimination. Now, it didn't have a lot of teeth to actually force companies not to discriminate, but at least it established a precedent and got people talking about that this exists and a way to document it. And then after the war, that was disbanded, but states began to publish, to start to establish their own fair employment practice laws. And Ohio did that in 1959. So it was a law banning employment discrimination in our state. Whether it was enforced is a whole nother story. And that's true of a lot of legislation. It's not just enough to have laws in the books, you have to actually enforce them. We had federal level legislation in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that got teeth in 1972 with the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. And I'm also showing you deindustrialization, which had a special significance in Cleveland because really starting in the 1950s, we started to see factories closing down. And because African Americans were last in line for those jobs, they fought hard to get those jobs during World War II. They come in at the end of the seniority line. So they're already being laid off after the Korean War. It's not really till the 1970s when a lot of white unionized workers also start getting laid off when this becomes really talked about and noticed. So those are some kinds of ways in which just the kind of job that you had could impact housing inequality. Okay, trying to advance my slides. Not sure what's going on there. Okay. All right. So another one would be lender discrimination. And some major dates here. Again, I can talk you through some details of redlining, but a government corporation established in 1933 was the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And it actually made rescue loans to homeowners. They refinanced people's mortgages from 1933 to 1936. And they actually gave those to Black homeowners as well. That's a little known fact that I can explain in more detail. But then they went on to make these redlining maps after. So they kind of, counterbalanced their relative, lack of discrimination with putting in place a very destructive precedent that private industry went on to discriminate against Black borrowers. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation was disbanded in 1951 once all those 15-year loans, refinancing loans, were paid off. The Federal Housing Administration stuck around longer, and for its first 16 years, it actually openly promoted segregation. It would not insure any mortgages that were issued in areas that were racially mixed. So in order to get this loan insurance, these neighborhoods had to be segregated. And a very small number went to all Black neighborhoods, but the overwhelming majority, over 95%, went to white areas and especially suburbs. Now, I'm going to tell you about a court decision in a little bit in 1948 called Shelley versus Kramer, which caused the Federal Housing Administration to drop its openly racist, where it actually was saying you have to put in place covenants forbidding sale to Black people in white neighborhoods. It entered into a period where it just really kind of looked the other way. It didn't continue to promote segregation itself, but it didn't do anything to fix that. And it continued to issue loan insurance to developers who discriminated. Then in 1968, we had a Fair Housing Act passed. And at that point, the Federal Housing Administration began to enforce that new law. But a lot of the damage was already done. We had a Fair Housing Act passed at the federal level in 1968, which I'll tell you more about. It really didn't have real teeth until 1988 and has continued to be strengthened since then. Ohio had passed its own in 1965, saying it was illegal to discriminate in issuing, it is illegal to discriminate in showing homes to people for purchase. So that was a couple years before that. But it really wasn't until the 1970s when we started to get some federal level legislation that tried to undo some of the damage from the past. So that was the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in 1975, where banks had to say where they were making mortgages, and it became very apparent that they were favoring certain areas over others, and those tended to be suburban areas, tended to be overwhelmingly white areas. And then the Community Reinvestment Act actually incentivized banks to start lending in areas. So if people were living in the inner city and putting their money in a bank, the argument was they should be able to get a loan from that bank to buy wherever they wanted to buy if they were creditworthy. So that was instituted in 1977. This is just making the point that the Homeowners Loan Corporation did issue loans to African Americans. You can see an archaic word for Black people there that was in the census report we cited here, but about 24,000 Black families got these refinancing loans. And in an article that we wrote, we found that part of the logic there was for Black people to stay where they were. This government agency was willing to refinance their mortgages so that they wouldn't move into white neighborhoods. But more notoriously, the Homeowners Loan Corporation is known for these redlining maps. And they did an early version that was more hand-drawn, and then ones you've probably seen that were offset color lithographs. In fact, there's a fantastic resource, and I'm going to paste the link in the chat in case you want to explore the site if you've never heard of it. Actually, I don't seem to have it, but it's called Mapping Inequality. And you can see the URL there. I can give that to you later, but basically it's some colleagues of mine who have scanned and digitized all the existing examples of redlining maps from the 1930s that they could find in the National Archives. So, and they also have the area descriptions that went along with those maps. So not only were these maps that had a color-coded system of where the government felt that mortgages were most secure. That meant where they thought people were most likely to pay. And one thing they found out was that there was no connection between people's likelihood to pay and this neighborhood rating system they came up with. They found out that in some cities, the supposedly least likely to pay areas, these red areas, and that's where the term redlining comes from, had actually the best area record of repayment. So despite that, they continue to promote this idea, and it was very destructive because banks picked up on this and instituted their own version of this. Every bank would have made its own redlining map, but you can see the kind of ways that they talk about this neighborhood, that it's the least desirable, that it has all this undesirable activity going on like industries and railroads. And I'm showing you Cleveland's main Black neighborhood, Cedar Central, in this slide. But they, just to give you some sense of what the rating system was like, green was considered supposedly the most desirable, most likely to pay back their loans. And again, this didn't hold true everywhere. So those would have been new housing. They would have had ample green space, good accessible transportation, safe pedestrian areas, no railroads or industry. And they would have had these deed restrictions forbidding sale to African Americans and other people of color. Then they had blue neighborhoods that were slightly older, maybe 30 or 40 years old at the time the maps were made. And these were kind of the yesteryear's nicest housing. So it was housing that was starting to maybe become aged. If they had racial restrictions, those were expiring. And so I'm showing you the Cedar Lee area of Cleveland Heights that was considered a B-rated area at the time. By the way, the first one was Shaker Heights, if you read the caption. Then you had the C-rated neighborhoods. And also these neighborhoods had different descriptions associated with them. The green ones were called best or most desirable. The B ones were called still desirable. And now the C or yellow ones were called definitely declining. And these were areas typically where working class white people lived, very often immigrants like Southern and Eastern European immigrants. They had not been developed with the same plan, so they might have houses on different frontages. They might sometimes have multiple houses on one lot. They didn't have as good access to green space. They didn't have, they had more proximity to industry. And then you had your D neighborhoods, the red neighborhoods, the so-called hazardous or least desirable neighborhoods. And these were like the yellow neighborhoods, but considered even more likely to decline, more likely to not pay their loans. But again, that was not true. And I'm showing you Little Italy here because it's really striking. Not all these neighborhoods were Black neighborhoods. In fact, only about 35% of them were, if you look on a citywide, countrywide basis. So Little Italy, which now today is a heavily gentrified, desirable place to live, considered to have all this cultural amenities, was considered kind of doomed to decline. Even Ohio City here, a yellow neighborhood, is now one of the most desirable places to live in the city. So really the point that I would make is that it was really about investment. If you put money into any of these neighborhoods, they can rebound, they can be revitalized, but that just wasn't part of the mentality in the 1930s when these maps were made. There's an idea that there's a life cycle of neighborhoods that inevitably dooms them to decline, and that a lower and lower status groups are going to move into these neighborhoods. And significantly, even though not all red neighborhoods were Black neighborhoods, virtually all Black neighborhoods were red. So even if it was a middle-class Black neighborhood with a new housing, it was still considered doomed to decline. And when the message got out about this, banks basically brought this into a reality. They stopped lending in those areas. And so it led to decline in some of these areas that had been theorized, but wasn't actually an inevitability. And the Federal Housing Administration also made these kinds of maps. I recently found out that they destroyed a lot of their maps in 1969 in response to a lawsuit, and that probably had to do with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But they also used maps to determine what areas were going to be eligible for loan insurance. And the interesting thing about this government redlining activity is we didn't really find out about this until the 1980s. It had been discussed in certain quarters in the real estate profession in the 1930s. So it wasn't a top secret project. Again, I'm willing to talk in more detail about that, but we kind of forgot about this and that the government had actually promoted this. And a lot of the focus by the 1960s and 70s was on banks. So there's an awareness that banks were not lending on equal terms to Black people. And we started to see fair housing efforts. And Cleveland was very active in this. There were many efforts to promote equal access to housing with greater or lesser degrees of success. But again, this is a focus on private industry more so than on the government itself. There were neighborhood activists like Gail Chinchada of Chicago, who really pressured banks to lend fairly, to lend to the people who had their money deposited with those banks. And finally, in 1977, we had President Jimmy Carter sign that Community Reinvestment Act, which again, incentivized banks to lend in these areas, force them to open their books and show where they were lending. And we've strengthened that sense, although we always have to be vigilant and make sure that that gets enforced and that it doesn't get weakened. Okay, so I also wanted to talk about land use controls and how those also historically have been used to promote housing inequality on the basis of race. So these were zoning and restrictive covenants, and I'll explain what that is. The thing about zoning is it isn't necessarily racial in nature, but I would emphasize the very first use of this was an attempt to mandate where Black people could live or not live in cities. And several cities, including St. Louis, including Baltimore, including Louisville, passed zoning ordinances which said where white people could live and where Black people could live. And Atlanta tried this as well. In fact, Atlanta continued trying to do it after the Supreme Court ruled that this was a violation of the 14th Amendment in 1917 in the Buchanan versus Worley case. In 1926, restrictive covenants were found by the Supreme Court to be legal and enforceable. So basically what this is an agreement by white homeowners that they're not going to sell to Black people. And if anyone did, they could be sued by their neighbors. And so a restrictive covenant was a kind of petition after the fact, and those were declared to be binding by Corgan v. Buckley in 1926. A deed restriction was one that was built right in from the start, and those were considered more kind of ironclad. And I would note that zoning itself was only found to be legal in the 1926 Supreme Court case, Euclid v. Ambler, and that actually was a Cleveland area Supreme Court ruling that established the legality of zoning. Cleveland passed its own zoning ordinance in 1929. And then another important landmark that I mentioned earlier was Shelley v. Kramer, which found that these kinds of private agreements between white homeowners were not enforceable. So you could not say this house cannot be sold to a Black person. Sometimes that would also say to an Asian person or even a Jewish or a Italian person in some cases. Shaker Heights notoriously had covenants also banning Jews as well as African Americans. So just to give you some sense of this, again, the first attempt of zoning was to try and mandate where Black people and white people could live in the city. And this was a campaign in support of this ordinance in St. Louis. And I would draw your attention to these terms they're using, like invasion, an entire block ruined. So that's the kind of terms in which white homeowners were encouraged to think about demographic shifts. And again, once you get the government openly agreeing with this, you get these practices becoming more widespread, they become very difficult to reverse. In fact, I would argue that some of this mentality, there's still a hint of that with us today, where many white Americans, once the percentage of Black population gets past a certain point, they tend to move somewhere else. This is an ad promoting one of these subdivisions that had race-based restrictions. And I find this very ironic because it's for Salt Lake City. And Salt Lake City in the 1920s was 99% white. So even in areas where there were no people of color even living there yet, there was kind of a preemptive effort. And this was through the efforts of the real estate industry to try and promote these, to get the word out, and to offer these language that could be adopted. And many developers around the country, even in places where there were no significant populations of color, put these in place. And then with that Corgan v. Buckley ruling in 1926, you saw an even greater proliferation of these restrictive covenants and deed restrictions. This is an ad from a Washington, D.C. paper, actually making reference to that Supreme Court ruling and encouraging white homebuyers to buy in restricted areas and to pass these agreements forbidding sale to Black people. So now I want to get into the fourth major contributor to housing segregation I mentioned. And again, this had more to do with both white agency and Black agency. So you can see how structure and agency kind of interact here. And what I would want to look at would be the race riots that really peaked in 1919. There were some earlier in 1917. There were some extending into the 20s, like the most notorious Tulsa race massacre of 1921. And there's some debate over how to characterize these events. A race riot in this sense would be white people fighting against Black people and Black people fighting back in many cases. Starting in East St. Louis, Black people fought back. In Chicago, they fought back. And even in Tulsa, they tried to fight back. But the entire Black business district was burned down in Tulsa. This has been getting a lot of press lately, so I assume people know more about that. But you could consider these as a pogrom. There are disproportionately Black populations suffered the casualties. For example, in Chicago, of the 35 casualties, 26 of them were African Americans. And these took place in the North as well. In fact, they tended to, there was one in Houston in 1917, but actually more of these took place in the North, places like Omaha, for example, in addition to Chicago. So it wasn't just, it wasn't a regional sort of thing. And another phenomenon was upwardly mobile Black families moving to these outlying areas that I looked at in Cleveland and being harassed by white homeowners. So for example, the Dr. Ossian Sweet in Detroit, and I can tell you more about these cases because I have some slides. He was mobbed and his windows were broken in an attempt to try and dislodge him. And those took place in Cleveland as well. We had several notorious cases. I'd also include their conflicts over access to swimming pools and other public facilities, public recreational facilities like amusement parks. For example, Euclid Beach Park in Cleveland didn't allow African Americans to use the dance floor. And there was a kind of a brawl at Euclid Beach Park in 1946. There were larger scale conflicts that broke out again during World War II. The Detroit race riot, again, where Black and white people were fighting each other in the streets. And then in 1951, there was a case of a Black family moving into an apartment in Cicero, Illinois. I'll tell you more about that when I show you the slides. But 10,000 National Guard had to be called out to put down this civil disturbance. And that also continued into the 1950s, including in Cleveland. So let me just give you some details on some of these. The Chicago race riot broke out when a Black youth was swimming at the beach on Lake Michigan and swam across an invisible line dividing the Black section of the beach from the white section of the beach. And this led to him being stoned by a white bather. He drowned. And then you saw fights break out between Black and white people. You saw white people especially targeting African-American homes in outlying areas where there was less of a strength in numbers. There were some cases of white people being beaten up and even killed in Black neighborhoods as well. But again, this is disproportionately affecting African-Americans, some of them losing their possessions as a result. Dr. Ossian Sweet was a physician who moved into this house on Detroit's outskirts in 1925. On the very first night he was there, the house was surrounded by an angry white mob. And after a couple nights of this, he actually decided to fire a warning shot fearing that his house was going to be burned down, and he killed a white bystander. So actually, the NAACP took this case. Clarence Darrow argued it, and he won the case on the grounds of self-defense. However, his marriage broke up as a result of this. He lost business. He wound up, in pretty tough economic straits, even though he wasn't forced out of that house. And I mentioned in Cleveland, there were also conflicts around beach access. I'm showing you here Gordon Park in 1917, and you can clearly see these two Black youths that are outside of this kind of rope that's dividing off the beach where white people are swimming from where they're allowed to access. And they're going to have to jump in off the rocks if they even try to swim. So Cleveland may not have had an open riot breakout, around this time, but there was the potential for that, and there was discriminatory treatment around these same issues of access to public facilities. And I found this in my book, that there were clashes over access, especially at Woodland Hills Park Pool. You can just get a real sense of just how overwhelmingly white these spaces were. And if you were Black and you were thinking of trying to go swim there, there was a pretty intimidating prospect. And in fact, when Black people did try and use the pool, they would be harassed, they would be attacked in some cases. There was an actual brawl that broke out the first summer that Woodland Hills Pool was opened. In one case, they had mud thrown at them. They were verbally threatened. This is something that African Americans had to face, and they tried to mobilize against. In fact, the NAACP and Black churches led a campaign to gain access at Woodland Hills Park Pool. Cleveland's newspaper editor of the Cleveland Gazette, who'd been a former one of the few Black Ohio State legislators, spoke out against this. He'd actually sponsored a civil rights law in 1894. So again, Black people tried to push back against and use their own agency to try and change the dynamic. There were two especially notorious cases in Cleveland in 1925 in the Cleveland area. One was Dr. Charles Garner on Wade Park Avenue. When he moved there in 1925, one of his white neighbors or someone dynamited his house when it was under construction 2 different times. But he stayed there. He actually refused to move, and he eventually his white neighbors stopped harassing him. He actually remained there for the rest of his life. Showing him there in 1940. But what the white neighbors did do was to pass a restrictive covenant after the fact to try and prevent other Black families from moving there. So again, until these were made unenforceable by that Shelley v. Kramer ruling, they tried to make it impossible for other families to sell. Again, this gives you a sense of how these 2 factors of structure and agency could interact. And even though Dr. Garvin was able to stay in his house, that same year, we saw another Black doctor and his family move to Shaker Heights. And his house was also surrounded by an angry white mob. They broke all the windows, and they actually succeeded in intimidating him and his family to the point where they moved back to Cleveland. And then Shaker Heights, after this, was so outraged that a Black person would try to buy there. They tried to revoke all the deeds which had neglected to put in a racial clause and try and get them reissued with those more ironclad race-based deed restrictions. They formed a Shaker Heights Protective Association. And you can get some sense really just of how Shaker Heights at this time regarded itself. It's kind of think of itself as a fortress against the city with its factories and its hustle and bustle, as kind of this walled off area. And so if we think of Shaker Heights today as having a proud legacy of fair housing efforts, that really didn't arise until well after World War II. I mentioned Detroit had a renewed outbreak of civil disorder, another race riot between Black people and white people in World War II. And again, this is white on black, black on white. It's very different from the 1960s urban uprisings where basically there's no white people living in the neighborhoods any longer, where African Americans were coming in the streets. Most of those clashes were between black residents and white police officers, not other white residents. And Chicago was a particularly notorious place where you had large scale incidents of white residents coming out to oppose African Americans moving into previously all white neighborhoods, including housing projects. At this time, housing projects were segregated, so the first black family to move into a housing project sometimes could set off a mob of 500 or more angry white residents. And again, the most notorious of these was the Cicero riot of 1951, where 10,000 National Guard had to be called into Cicero, which is a suburb of Chicago, all white suburb. What had happened there was a black family moved into an apartment. And when white residents of Cicero found out about this, they broke in and ransacked the apartment. They set fires outside of the building. And again, this had to be put down. This guy in the lower left corner was actually poked by a guardsman with a bayonet. So you can get some sense of how intense these conflicts got. And this is the kind of baseline. If I were to say Cleveland was not as bad of a place in terms of racial conflict in the 1950s as other places, this is what I would have in mind. We didn't see a large scale outbreak of white on black and white street clashes like we saw here, like we saw in Chicago or Detroit. But still in Cleveland, we had these kinds of incidents, especially when black families moved into new all white areas like Lee Harvard. Lee Harvard saw similar mobbing of the house, but what happened in the case of Cleveland was the mayor, Charles Burke, actually came out and talked to the residents. He told them that he would be providing police protection to the Stewart family who had moved there. And that's a way in which Cleveland stood out. It took a more proactive approach to race relations and mediating these kinds of conflicts so that you didn't get the same kind of clashes in the streets that you got in Chicago and Detroit. But it's not to say that these incidents didn't happen. In fact, they happened all throughout these outlying areas of the city into the 1960s and even beyond. Just to give you some sense, a lot of these times this would happen at night. Families' homes would be vandalized. So this was just a kind of way to signal that black families were unwelcome. They were white residents were hoping in many cases to drive them out, but in reality, most of these neighborhoods became black neighborhoods. And white people just chose to move away rather than share that living space. I'm showing you here one incident on the west side on McGowan Avenue, which is still, overwhelmingly a white area of the city of Cleveland. But in many of the areas on the east side, those did eventually become black neighborhoods. We saw this in suburbs like Shaker Heights. In 1957, a black dentist's garage was blown up when he moved to the Ludlow neighborhood. But this is where Shaker Heights' reputation started to turn around. Although some white residents left in response to the Pegs moving in, others formed the Ludlow Community Association. And this is where Shaker Heights started really trying to make more of an effort to be accepting. And this is where, it gets its reputation till today. I would note this also is true in Cleveland Heights. Cleveland Heights is also regarded as, a well-integrated location, compared to other places, but it also had a spate of violent resistance where when the black director of Karamu House, the black theater, moved into this home in Cleveland Heights, the home was firebombed. So that led to the formation of Heights Citizens for Human Rights. So again, Cleveland is not escaping from this legacy of racial conflict and racial violence. It's just not being allowed to escalate to the point that it did in certain other areas. And as I mentioned, a lot of white people eventually just move. This was promoted by real estate salespeople who would create a panic. The idea here was to buy from white people at the lowest possible price and then turn around and sell it at a markup to middle-class black people who were looking for housing. There was kind of an artificial housing shortage created by segregation. So they would flock to areas like Lee Harvard once those became available. And again, this tended to create kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I know I'm running short on time. I wanted to cover some of the where we find ourselves today and point out Cleveland's still a very highly segregated metropolitan area, that the 2008 mortgage crisis fell disproportionately on Black people relative to white. And even if you were relatively well off, there was more likelihood if you're Black that you would be sold a subprime mortgage. You can see even in places like Solon here and Euclid, you're getting a lot of these mortgages on very unfavorable terms, subprime mortgages. Over time, the disparity in incomes and home prices led to a Black-white wealth gap. So really the generational legacy of inequality is very much with us today. The Center for Community Solutions has done a really great job of doing graphics to emphasize this. And finally, I would just say that redlining, even though it's been banned since the 1968 Fair Housing Act, we can see there's still this way of thinking persists, and even people are still publishing maps trying to rate areas in a way that has a clear relationship to race. So this is one that came up in 2018 that I and other users on Twitter uncovered. This is a fantastic resource that I recommend to you, Mapping Inequality. And I've also got some recent articles and other resources if you want to learn more about redlining. And of course, I'm happy to answer those questions, including if you want to email me. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have starting right now. So hope that wasn't too much of a whirlwind presentation. I'm going to be happy to answer any questions you may have at this point.
Great. Wow. Thanks, Todd. Really appreciate all of that. And then at Cleveland Votes posted in the chat that URL that you shared, but we will include this information in a follow-up email. Please do enter any questions you have in the chat and we can get going. I'm sharing right now. You're active on Twitter, as you ended with a Twitter post right there. But you have a 17 tweet thread that has gotten a lot of traction. I just checked and there were almost 230 retweets at this point talking about the roots of redlining. So getting back to that topic where you ended. And on the, you close that out by talking about, you hope that spurred some crucial conversations about the history of redlining and this is, I think, most important, how to undo its damaging effects. And I was just wondering if you can talk about that or just kind of the stretch of that tweet and the intent there a little bit.
Thank you so much. Well, we have a new article, a colleague and I, where we explored where did these ideas originate. And we found one economics professor, Richard T. Ely, had founded an Institute for Land Economics at the University of Wisconsin in 1925. And he really helped to add some intellectual heft to these ideas. He also was what we now would call a scientific racist. He believed in eugenics. He believed in this hierarchy of races that's been completely debunked, but was very common at the time. And so he basically allied himself with the National Association of Real Estate Boards and got his grad students to write textbooks, all kind of promoting this idea that race has a relationship to real estate values, and specifically that when Black people move into an area, the home values inevitably go down. So even though that was, kind of justifying white people's, fears and beliefs, it became almost like a scientific theory. And then those same students went on to serve in government agencies like the Homeowners Loan Corporation and Federal Housing Administration, where they implemented those policies. So if you're curious about that, I've got quite a lot of documentation, and it could give you a sense of where does this idea of redlining come from and how did it spread?
Thank you. So one of the comments in the chat is just a thanks out to you for helping put Cleveland in a wider context. One of the books that you've co-authored is titled The Making of Cleveland's Black Suburb in the City, Lee, Seville, and Lee Harvard. I was just curious, keeping that, focused here in Northeast Ohio, what was that research like? Or is there some, fascinating or fantastic story that you were able to uncover in the course of that work?
Numerous incredible stories. This was a really fortuitous coincidence that the Cleveland Restoration Society, which is a leading preservation nonprofit, became interested in Lee Harvard and Lee Seville because they discovered independently from me that there were African-American owned construction companies that built some of the housing there. So at the same time I was finishing up my book, finding out some of the same things, they were documenting it, and we were brought together and decided to collaborate. So I helped them interview some residents who had bought these houses from Black builders like Arthur Bussey, like Albert Taborn, William Wooldridge. There were a number of different Black builders who built this housing, and we found out other things, like there was actually a Black mayor in Miles Heights. Miles Heights was a suburb that was basically annexed by Cleveland in 1930. And there was a Black mayor elected there. So before Cleveland had one of the first Black mayors, Carl Stokes, we had Arthur Johnston, mayor of Miles Heights. And so a lot of people came forward and told their stories, gave their photographs. We came up with a really amazing book that Cleveland Restoration Society published. And that is an ongoing project if you happen to know someone who grew up there or bought a house there or who was involved in those construction efforts. They would love to hear from you. So you could reach out to me about that.
Great. We can shamelessly plug your book as well, and people can contact you for that information. There's a question here. If you know of any research or books out there that explore some of the changes that we've seen in East Cleveland over time.
Now, there's a book that's a little older by Dennis Keating. I think it's called The Racial Dilemma in the Suburbs. I'm not sure the title. I apologize for that. But it was written in the late 80s, early 90s, and it talks in quite some detail about East Cleveland. I also have an article from 2006. It's about Little Italy and about a incident during the Huff riots, where a man from Little Italy shot a Black man who was driving nearby. I talk about East Cleveland in there because East Cleveland was an area that a considerable number of Italian Americans moved into nearby East Cleveland, and then that became another destination for upwardly mobile African American in-movers. So I talk a little bit about East Cleveland in there, but I don't know of a really extensive study. If people want to email me, I could recommend some other things about the early history of East Cleveland when it was really kind of a rather posh suburb, where John D. Rockefeller had an estate. But that would be a great place for people to dig in further and look at the history there. It becomes one of these Black suburban destinations, one of the earliest ones, actually. Around 1960, the first Black families started moving there.
Great. And I did just post your email address in the chat. And again, that'll be in some of the follow-up information. There's a question here, as an historian, asking about your thoughts about the political debate, I suppose, but thoughts about critical race theory and how that's showing itself in the headlines right now.
Yeah. Well, when I chose that quote from Thomas Segru, I was wondering if anyone might take issue with it or want to debate that a little more. I think, critical race theory is something that's very much more specific, and it's having to do with laws. It's more talked about among legal scholars, but it's become kind of a catch-all term, almost like a boogeyman, and really is an excuse to not talk about race. So I think, we have to talk about race. We could call it whatever we want, but it's kind of disturbing, the thought that people just don't want to talk about this because it has a clear, the racial inequality of the past has a clear connection to the present, as I've tried to illustrate. But one, I think, misunderstanding with critical race theory is that it delimits people to the point where if you're Black, there's no way you can get ahead in this society. And it is tougher if you're Black, obviously, because of the structural factors, but those can be changed. We've put in place laws trying to make our society more equal. We could change them further to ensure that. So I even heard a Black critic on the news yesterday saying she didn't like the sounds of this because it seemed to send the message that there's no way her kids can make it in America. But that's not really what it's saying. It's saying more that we have to understand this relationship between structure and agency. And why do we still have inequality once we've passed laws? Why do we still have a Black-white wealth gap, even though we've had things like, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, for the last more than 50 years now? So clearly I believe we do need to talk about this. And I think we need to, have that dialogue and talk through that in a way without just dismissing it off the bat. But we couldn't debate to what extent is structure versus agency, how do those interact, and how do those, shape the outcomes that we see. I'm certainly open to debate that.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that, just as a final question, as an historian, as an expert in this field, what are your thoughts, or can you comment on in what ways the teaching and understanding of history has evolved and changed over time, especially when you consider a lot of the national conversation and movement that's taken place?
Right. I think at the college level, I think there's been an idea that you don't really want to touch this until the college level. And I think now, more recently, we're talking about this all the way down to the elementary school level. So it's not really a forbidden topic. But I think that some people are taking issue with that. Some people may have an idea that history is to kind of instill patriotism, and the idea that the United States is the greatest country in the world, always has been, that we're exceptional. And so they're uncomfortable with comparing to different places in the world, to looking at that legacy and being, somewhat critical of it. I think that, if we can understand that, it helps us to appreciate the country more. I'd make an argument that you can still love the country and feel patriotic and face up to this legacy. There's not a real connection between the other, but I don't believe that history should be used just to instill patriotism. I think it's a tool to help understand how did we get to where we are today and where could we go. If we're really going to make it into a new future, I think we need to understand the past and how we got here. And it's encouraging. Even though there's pushback, I think there's pushback because more people are becoming interested in this. More people are having a more nuanced, complicated understanding of our past. And I really think that's healthy. I think that if you try and just suppress that, it's never really going to go away.
That's great. Dr. Michney, thank you so much. Appreciate your work and appreciate the time you spent with us. I'll turn things over to Marianne Crossley, our CEO, for final thoughts.
Thanks, Bob. Dr. Michney, that was just amazing, just incredibly informative and very powerful. So thank you for sharing your amazing research and knowledge and passion for this topic with all of us.